This program is made possible by the University of Pittsburgh with additional funding from the members of WQED, the Pittsburgh Foundation, and the Allegheny Regional Asset District. One of the things I remember about the Courier is it came to our house every Thursday, religiously.
It was something that was a very influential piece of African Americans in Pittsburgh.
It was really the premier paper, national paper of Black America, not just in Pittsburgh, but around the country.
It was exclusive to a particular community with a particular interest.
I came to Courier primarily because growing up in Tennessee, I wanted to know why there was so much hatred between white America and Black America.
It raised issues that may not have been talked about everywhere else.
Most of the white papers, like the Post-Gazette or the Press, weren't covering in detail the experiences that African Americans were facing on a daily basis.
This is my community. This is for me. So I know that each page that I look at, I'm going to see someone that looks like me.
If it was not for the Pullman porters, the Courier would not have had any circulation in the South. Because in the South, you could not have newspapers, Black newspapers, saying what they were saying and doing what they was doing as far as the civil rights struggle was concerned.
Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who helped circulate the newspaper across the country because they took the paper with them on the trains and delivered the paper through, especially throughout the South, where some postal employees wouldn't deliver the paper.
Some of the porters would take the packets of the Pittsburgh Courier and either hide them away under mattresses or in the baggage or something. And then when they would get to a Birmingham or a place like that, they would distribute it to a local minister who was going to come meet the train and then take that bunch of papers to his congregation. And my grandfather had been a Pullman porter for 42 years. He retired in the early 1950s, just before I was born. He never told me specifically that he helped deliver the Courier, but I know just from reading history now that the porters did play a significant role in that.
Around 1907, the founder of the Pittsburgh Courier was a man named Edward Nathaniel Harleston, a native of Charleston, South Carolina. He had actually written a book of poetry called A Toiler's Life, published in 1907. And shortly after that, he moved to Pittsburgh and worked at the Heinz Company on the north side and began to distribute a paper called the Courier.
And he hired a young new lawyer named Robert Vann, who became the editor of the paper and the sort of the publisher and Mr. Everyman for the paper. And in 1910, Robert Vann bought the paper. And Vann was really quite a remarkable figure. He was from North Carolina, came to study at the University of Pittsburgh, and in 1909 he graduated from Pitt Law School. He was the first Black graduate of Pitt Law School. Vann also hired top-rate writers. They had George Schuyler, who was a fine writer, novelist, columnist, and he was a satirist. He had John Clark, who wrote a weekly column called Wiley Avenue. He hired outstanding sports writers. William Nunn became one of the leading Black sports writers in the country and was a real campaigner for many causes, including the integration of baseball. He had photographers. One of the best black photographers in the country. Teenie Harris worked on the paper, and Harris was just one of 6 or 7 photographers.
The Pittsburgh Courier was not the only African-American paper to be published in Pittsburgh, especially in the 1930s and the years leading up to the war. There were a couple of other papers, little smaller operations than the Courier, but they did exist. The Courier was looked upon as sort of the middle-class newspaper. Leading up to the war years, what Robert Vann did was he sent correspondents to Europe who were covering the Nazi regime. This is before Hitler went into Poland and Austria and Czechoslovakia in the late 30s. He sent J.A. Rogers in 1936 to Ethiopia to cover the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Rogers reported directly from the front lines.
Frank Bolden, who's one of the great correspondents for the Courier, he was one of only 2 accredited black journalists accredited by the U.S. military to cover what the soldiers were doing overseas. And Bolden covered the 92nd Infantry, the black infantry in Italy, and he covered the Burma Road. He got an offer from Mahatma Gandhi to stay at his house for 2 weeks and interview Gandhi. When Nehru heard about that, Nehru invited him to his house. So he interviewed Nehru. He interviewed President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Chiang Kai-shek, Joseph Stalin.
The vast problems of the war against Japan were discussed.
Bolden went on to become really this internationally known, is now in the museum in Washington, the Museum Hall of Fame, with his military uniform and typewriter and things like that.
During World War II, it was reported at that time that the Courier was read by over 1 million people worldwide.
The Courier set the tone for when black Americans shifted from the Republican Party to the Democrat Party in the 1930s. Robert Vann said, because there's a new era, there's unemployment. This is in the 30s during the Great Depression, and we need the sorts of programs that Roosevelt is advocating, ones that will help the working man, the working class, white and black. And so the Courier led the campaign to turn blacks from the Republican Party to the Democrat Party. Vann always had a campaign going. He had a campaign against lynching, had a campaign to integrate baseball. And the most famous was known as the Double V campaign for, it was called Victory at Home, Victory Abroad. And so America was fighting against Nazi racism in Europe, and the Courier made it a point to, well, let's fight against American racism at home at the same time. We'll have democracy in both places. The amazing thing is the campaign caught on magnificently among whites as well as among blacks. For the first time in America, it made it a patriotic thing to be for integration and for racial equality.
Some of the issues after World War II that the Courier was covering, they continued the Double V campaign in a sense, but they called it the Double E campaign. Which was focused more on economic development in the black community. They felt that that was the next stage of freedom, in a sense, in America for African Americans. And so the Courier covered all those things, especially the civil rights movement in the 50s. You know, before Dr. King became a national voice and the Montgomery bus boycott basically drafted him to take the leadership of that issue, the Courier sent their reporters, their Southern correspondents, to cover the happenings.
One of the articles that our family kept forever was an article from February of 1953, which was about 2 months before I was born. And it was an article that included reference to my father. My father was pastor of Bethlehem Baptist Church in McKeesport in the mid-1950s. And the headline said, "Ministers reject Jim Crow picnic proposal. Kennywood would allow black churches to have their picnics at Kennywood, but the black churches weren't allowed to use the pool." I realized that this article is in our home for a reason. They kept that article. I didn't see an article like that from the Post-Gazette or the Pittsburgh Press or the Pittsburgh Sun-Telegraph.
The Courier was campaigned for black rights, civil rights, but it always did so in the sense of this is important to make America the place it should be and would be.
The Courier, more than anyone, opened the doors for Jackie Robinson, which opened the doors for Roberto Clemente, which opened the doors for Willie Stargell and all the other players.
Wendell Smith, who was sports editor back in the days of Jackie Robinson, spent several months actually living with Jackie Robinson to show readers what it was like, his journey through baseball, his journey breaking the color barrier.
William Nunn became one of the leading black sports writers in the country and was a real campaigner for many causes, including the integration of baseball. Nunn was the key factor in opening up baseball and bringing Jackie into the major leagues. Then his son, William Nunn Jr., he went on and continued this and became a sports editor with the Courier, but also as a recruiter with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And he brought in some of the best Steeler players, especially under the era of Chuck Noll. Nunn knew the black colleges.
He knew the coaches, he knew the athletic director, he knew the deans, the head of the school, the presidents.
He knew who the best players coming out of these black schools were and was able to recruit them for the Steelers.
Bill Nunn should be in the Hall of Fame, not because he built the Steelers into a powerhouse. Also dealt with that rule that they had in the NFL at the time of 3 to 5 blacks, and that's it. If you take a look at the makeup of the NFL during the 50s and 60s, and coming into the 70s, you find that generally had your 5 or 6 blacks. Now, you may have whole starting defenses as black. I started with the Courier in 1973. I came to the Courier because I wanted to work for the black newspaper. I got to know the Pirates players, especially Al Oliver. Al opened up the doors for me as far as getting into the Pirates locker room. Because when I first got there, for some reason they had me sitting out in the hall, and the other reporters was in and out. And Al Oliver came by and said, "Why are you standing out here in the hall?" And I said, "Well, that's what the PR man told me." And he said, "I'll talk to the PR man."
The Courier offices were also right across the street from the old Center Avenue Y, and legend has it that when Roberto Clemente first came to town, he stayed right there. One of the things Bill Nunn raised a lot about Clemente was that Clemente always felt as though he was not given the recognition due by the other Pittsburgh newspapers.
The problem was he was black, that was number one. He was dark-skinned, and he spoke English, but not as clear as most of us. Tried to interview as many blacks as I could, and the general feeling was that Clemente and most black players, for some reason the local media, did not want to give Clemente his due. Courier was created to give a voice to the black community. And when it comes to the players, give the black players their voice. And that's what the role, I saw the role of the Courier has been.
I was just going through some of my archives, and I found these wonderful Pittsburgh Couriers. This one's from 1979. It was a special fashion edition, and I'm on the cover. I model, I commentate fashion shows, so I've been in the Courier a lot. And one year I was thinking about what type of a part-time job did I want, and I got a tip that the person who was there as the lifestyle editor was soon going to retire. And I thought that I think that sounds like a very good job for me. And here we are, 17 years later.
The women's department of the Courier always had outstanding reporters and columnists. Hazel Garland being one of the premier examples of that. And her columns were about women, but they were not just about women. They were how women are helping to shape the black community, their roles in the church, their roles in business, their roles in the community.
Hazel Garland, who eventually became the first female editor of a major weekly like the Courier, was from the McKeesport area, so she knew my dad when he was pastor there. And when I got married, I remember in her column, Things to Talk About, was this little article that the son of Reverend Hayes got married, and he married a girl from McKeesport. So our family has, from Reverend Hayes raising issues about Kennywood's practices to little Timmy getting married, all of it has been a part of our life in the Courier.
She was my immediate boss, and she basically was my mentor. I loved her because she was down to earth. She knew her news, she knew her sports, she knew her entertainment, she knew her social society. She had the contacts to be able to reach anybody with anybody in black entertainment.
The so-called Chitlin Circuit was always well covered in terms of who was doing what in the local community.
The Chitlin Circuit was black jazz clubs and nightclubs that were available to black performers who couldn't go somewhere else. In the arts and entertainment section, that's where you kind of find out who was coming to town. My mother would be interested in Count Basie coming to town, or Duke Ellington, or some of the contemporary people. They may have been covered in the mainstream press, but nothing like they were covered in the Courier. There would be profiles of people like Billy Eckstine. Errol Garner had roots here.
We saw nationally those stars that were on the horizon, so the entertainment world was very important. But more importantly, we saw people who were progressing as doctors, lawyers, politicians, moving on that level as well.
When I was a little girl, I met Teenie Harris because our family would go and have photographs taken, and we would go to Teenie Harris's studio. But to know that we actually work for the same newspaper is just mind-boggling.
I didn't take no pictures and no photography in school. I learned all this by just myself.
And really, when you look at, for example, the Teenie Harris photos, you get a sense of, despite all the obstacles and the handicaps and the misfortunes and the discrimination, that somehow these people, they did not have the sort of anger and bitterness and sense of futility that one might have gathered.
They show African Americans when we dressed up and we wore suits and ties and hats, and when we were going to the dinner parties, and in the world that a lot of people didn't know existed.
One of the things that the Courier and the black press did that was lacking in the white press is they gave a sense of daily life in the black community.
There would be wonderful stories about people who had graduated from college, and maybe there would be pictures of people who had gotten engaged or wedding pictures, but there would always be different pictures about the black community. And now I could be in Martha's Vineyard one day, and I could be in Homewood the next, covering a wonderful fashion show. So I was invited to a memorial for Bubby Nunn.
Bubby Nunn was Bill Nunn III, son of Bill Nunn Jr. He was in Spike Lee's movie, Do the Right Thing.
It was just such a wonderful event. Samuel L. Jackson was here. Spike Lee was here. I was just so happy and honored to be here as a part of the new Pittsburgh Courier.
The footstep of the march in Washington was firm. It aroused, even in dissenters, a larger awareness of the right of the Negroes as Americans to share equally not only...
Once the civil rights movement kicked in, the white press covered that as well. So the Courier no longer, the black press no longer had sort of a monopoly of news that blacks were interested in reading about. And this actually harmed the circulation of the Courier and the black press. The Courier circulation was around 350, 400,000 during World War II. By 1960, the period of the 50s, you see, it was down to about 100,000.
The Courier may have fallen victim to its own success. It raised the issue so that there was national attention. But then once there was national attention, you had the choice: do you want to have just the focus on civil rights in this paper, or, oh, I can get that somewhere else, which was sad. But there's a new Pittsburgh Courier, and they're carrying on that tradition.
By '65, their big competitor, the Chicago Defender, bought the Courier. The name changed to become the new Pittsburgh Courier.
When I first arrived, the paper was owned by John H. Singstack, and he was an incredible man. He was highly regarded and respected throughout this country. When he passed, then the Real Times organization came in and purchased the right to the publication, and they are headquartered in Detroit, and that's where we are today. I've been affiliated with the Courier since 1967. We had a fairly healthy publication in the sense that we had a local edition, and back then I think there were 14 regional publications.
I'll get the mayor's take on that.
Okay.
The paper really reverted back more to a local paper, which is how it began as a local paper. Van made it national. By the 60s, it's going back to being a local paper.
And beyond the physical product, we were online. We have kept up with the technology to a great extent. We're a multimedia company.
Pittsburgh Courier covers Pittsburgh public school sports that you won't see in the Post-Gazette or Summer. You will occasionally, but the Courier covers it every week. It covers issues that are important to the black community: education, economics.
When I got here, one of the first questions that Rod Doss, our editor and publisher, asked me was, how can we make sure that the Courier is relevant right now? We know that the Courier has a long and storied past, over 100 years, but like many publications across the country, circulation is dwindling. So he asked me, what can we do to be relevant about now?
We're doing more stories on millennials, so we're looking to attract a different audience.
We've revamped our website, newpittsburghcourier.com. We are very active on social media. Our Facebook page has thousands and thousands of local Pittsburghers who check it out every week. We are into videos now, and that's where a lot of this world is headed, and we're headed there too.
We are changing because we have to change. If you want people to see the paper, buy the paper, subscribe to the paper, then you have to make changes.
Many Pittsburghers have begun to like our page. They've begun to interact with us. We'll go to an event and post 40 pictures that will capture everybody at the event. So if you were at that event, yeah, sure, the news photo may be in the Courier, but on our Facebook page, we have captured pictures of seemingly all 150 or 175 people who were there.
There are a lot of people that have been exposed to the Courier through our event process. We do 50 Men and Women of Excellence. We do a Fab 40, which celebrates 40 young people under the age of 40, and we've been doing it for several years. So that says a lot about how we interact with the community, how we are engaged in the community, how we are regarded in the community.
It is just as relevant, just as important today as it was back then, because you know what, this world never stops. You've got young African Americans who are looking to find their voice. And you know what? The New Pittsburgh Courier is here to make sure that their voice is heard.
A lot has changed. The internet has changed every printed publication, but it still has its role in terms of making sure the community voice is heard.
It's a weekly that still contains a story that you won't find anywhere else.
We've covered thousands and thousands of people, and I think my biggest accomplishment, my greatest satisfaction is that they will tell their story.
The issues that were important to the community when I first came are still important today. We're looking at the resegregation of schools. We're looking at a lot of things that we thought were surpassed at one point in our history, but have become overly magnified in another sense today. We're still dealing with discrimination in one form or another. We're still dealing with housing inequality, segregation.
The Courier really has the freedom to comment on stories because we're talking about our own.
I believe it's one of those papers that can stand the test of time.
This program is made possible by the University of Pittsburgh with additional funding from the members of WQED, the Pittsburgh Foundation, and the Allegheny Regional Asset District. Thank you.